Donald Trump is the biggest terrorist in the world, and the MAGA GOP is the most powerful terrorist organization alive today. Osama bin Laden would have loved to have killed as many Americans as Donald Trump has with just his moronic approach to COVID during his first term, and by stealing Medicare and Medicaid from millions of Americans in his second term. More Americans right now live in fear of Donald Trump than ever lived in fear of Muslim terrorists. I'm just some guy living in the middle of nowhere, USA. Islamic terrorists were never a threat to me. But MAGA and Trump are a very real threat. Nations that would never capitulate to terrorists are bending the knee to Trump due to his threats. The terrorists couldn't destroy that nation's economy the way Trump can. News networks that stood defiant against Muslim extremists even after threatened with violence and even after they attacked Charlie Hebdo and unalived so many people, the media stood firm. Donald Trump is using Lawfare to sue the largest news media outlets in the world, and unlike any threat before, they are capitulating to Trump's threats and demands. How is this not terrorism? By every legal and functional definition of terrorism, Trump and MAGA politicians qualify, and history gives us the tools to understand exactly how. Let's circle back and define terrorism. U.S. law defines terrorism under Title 18, Section 2331 of the U.S. Code as acts that endanger human life and are intended to intimidate or coerce civilians or influence government policy. International law adds the same core elements, including the United Nations Conventions and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The elements are clear: violence, intimidation, coercion, and political ends. When Islamic terrorists planned attacks, the world called it terrorism. When Trump planned and executed attacks on everyone from peaceful protesters denying them their First Amendment rights to killing unidentified people in boats in international waters, we should accurately label that as terrorism as well. When Boko Haram kidnapped children to create fear and force their religio-political agenda, the world called it terrorism. When Donald Trump uses ICE agents to kidnap immigrants and their children from their homes, work, and school, whether they were undocumented or not, we should call that terrorism. When the Ku Klux Klan lynched Black Americans to control communities, the world recognized it as terrorism. When Trump's Supreme Court said it was okay to racially profile people of color in order to detain them, that should be recognized as racial terrorism. Donald Trump has threatened to label millions of Americans, Democrats, and anyone who speaks badly of him as extremists. He uses tariffs to punish entire populations of other countries for not towing his political line. We should call that terrorism. The label cannot be reserved just for people overseas or for brown people. It applies to Trump and the MAGA GOP here at home. Let's talk about their domestic terror tactics. Trump has deployed military forces against civilians exercising their First Amendment rights. In Los Angeles, he federalized the California National Guard over the objections of the governor and added hundreds of active duty Marines to the streets of the United States of America to intimidate protesters. Peaceful protesters and journalists were hit with tear gas, rubber bullets, and chemical irritants. Courts later ruled these actions illegal. Why isn't Trump in jail? He ordered illegal actions against American citizens and violated their rights overtly and intentionally. Impeach, remove, convict, imprison is the answer to that problem. In Washington, D.C., Trump declared a crime emergency, seized operational control of the Metropolitan Police, and unleashed stop and frisk patrols along with the National Guard troops. Federal judges described these measures as intimidation. Trump revoked security clearances from dozens of current and former officials as retaliation for disloyalty. Is that not wrong? Not only is that wrong in and of itself, but it also frightens others into silence and compliance. Terrorism. This mirrors tactics used by regimes throughout history. Mussolini's black shirts patrolled Italian cities with the blessings of the state, breaking strikes and terrorizing civilians. Pinochet used his armed forces to patrol Chilean streets, disappearing dissidents in the name of order. The Klan operated with local police looking the other way, beating and killing to enforce racial control. Trump's actions are the MAGA American version of this long and bloody playbook. It's just going to get worse unless we impeach, remove, convict, and imprison Donald Trump and all the politicians who have kept him in power and who have shielded him from accountability for his actions. All those conservatives voting to block the Epstein files would be a good place to start. What does he have on them? I'd like to know. Lawfare as terror through the courts. Trump has twisted the law into a weapon. He targeted law firms like Perkins, Coy, Covington, and Paul Weiss with executive orders that suspended contracts, revoked security clearances, and punished them for what? For defending his political opponents. Right. How is that not authoritarianism, fascism bullshit? Right there. For defending his political opponents. And the lawyers caved. He sued media outlets like ABC, CBS, the New York Times, and Penguin Random House, demanding billions of dollars. These suits are designed specifically as intimidation campaigns to silence criticism through financial fear. Trump's officials have even floated the idea of labeling the Democratic Party an extremist organization. That is the first step towards criminalizing their entire political opposition. Tens of millions of Americans would instantly become suspects under their own government. If anything, MAGA should be considered an extremist organization, and the MAGA government officials, not the entire MAGA population, they have been lied to, but the MAGA officials should be removed from office, arrested, convicted, and face whatever punishment treason and overthrowing our democracy calls for. History is filled with leaders who used courts to terrorize. Stalin held show trials where enemies were convicted before proceedings even began. Jim Crow laws used the courts to legitimize terror against Black Americans and to crush civil rights. Apartheid South Africa weaponized legal systems to enforce white supremacy. Trump stands in that same shameful tradition. This is constitutionalized terror. It uses the appearance of legality to normalize political violence and terror. Rhetorical and psychological terror. Trump governs through fear. His words are threats, dominate the streets. If you go after me, I'm coming after you. The radical left are terrorists. This is stochastic terrorism. Leaders like Trump incite violence without issuing direct orders. Their followers interpret the signals and act. Election workers receive death threats. Judges are harassed at their homes. Journalists are stalked online and in person. And Democratic politicians like Melissa Hortman are shot to death in their fucking homes. The violence is outsourced, but the message is unmistakable. Donald Trump supports this kind of political violence, and his response to Hortman's death bears that out. Vance Bolter did Trump's dirty work, and Trump couldn't be happier. There's probably a Trump presidential pardon and Medal of Honor in Bolter's future. This tactic is ancient. Hitler branded Jews and communists as enemies of the state, unleashing mobs and legitimizing violence. Senator Joseph McCarthy labeled Americans communists in the 1950s, destroying lives through accusations alone. The Ku Klux Klan spread terror not only through burning crosses, but through constant threat of reprisal for speaking out. Trump's rhetoric operates in the same psychological space. This is two-directional terror. Trump conditions his followers to fear immigrants, minorities, and Democrats. At the same time, he silences his opponents with the fear of retaliation. Even his allies live in fear, knowing he'll destroy them if they deny him anything or speak out against his authoritarian moves. MAGA conservative politicians are corrupt, spineless traitors to the United States of America, and they demonstrate that every day with their fealty to Herr Trump. The coming modern-day Nuremberg trials will bear all that out. Remember, maggots, just following orders will not spare you, just like it didn't spare the Nazis. And we can't forget the tariffs. Trump wields tariffs like weapons. He imposed a blanket 10% tariff on all imports worldwide. He punished countries like Brazil and Switzerland with massive economic penalties. He threatened any nation that bought Venezuelan oil with a 25% tariff. Is that not state-on-state terrorism? How is that not state-on-state terrorism? These are acts of coercion and discipline against entire populations. Under international law, collective punishment is prohibited. Yet Trump wields economic terror like a club to force governments and civilians into compliance with his demands. History is filled with economic terror. The British Empire used starvation blockades in Ireland and India to break resistance. Sanctions in apartheid South Africa were seen as punishment for political defiance. Modern authoritarian regimes like North Korea and Russia weaponize scarcity and trade restrictions to keep their population under control. Trump's tariffs operate on that same principle, inflicting fear and suffering for political leverage on entire populations. Even his own, really. Hey, farmers of America, how are you doing out there? Still happy with that Trump vote? Media and tech terror amplification. The First Amendment protects 5 fundamental rights from government interference: the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the right to peaceably assemble, and the right to petition the government. Trump and the MAGA GOP politicians are shitting all over the First Amendment every day at every turn. Is there not a protection offered by the First Amendment that they're not attacking? Trump is imposing Christianity on us in the hopes of a Christian swell during the next election. He clearly doesn't care about free speech as he goes after comedians and anyone who exposes his horrific rule. He's openly silencing news outlets using Lawfare and his control of the regulatory agencies like the FCC to force them into compliance. Trump's propaganda machine turns every lawsuit, every speech, and every threat into a headline. Fox News, Truth Social, X, YouTube, and thousands of right-wing podcasters, little mini Joseph Goebbels propaganda machines, spreading Trump's messages of lies and hate and misinformation at a rate that's impossible to calculate due to the sheer volume. Now, Trump has taken to having his billionaire friends buy out the networks and silence their voices on Trump. From news shows like 60 Minutes to comedians like Jon Stewart and Jimmy Kimmel, the First Amendment no longer seems to apply to them. Whenever conservatives wanted to say ugly things about black people or immigrants or just hate, and the world called them out for that, they're like, hey, my First Amendment rights, freedom of speech. Now, Liberals are calling out the atrocity of Trump, speaking out against him, and he is going after their freedom of speech. It's not the same. False stories about immigrants, voter fraud, and trans people spread like wildfire. Propaganda magnifies fear far beyond the original act. Authoritarian regimes have always understood the power of propaganda. The aforementioned Joseph Goebbels built Nazi Germany's propaganda state to keep citizens in fear and to stoke hatred of their neighbors. Soviet leaders flooded newspapers and radios with lies to portray dissidents as traitors. In Rwanda, radio broadcasters incited genocide by calling Tutsi people cockroaches. Donald Trump calls the left wing scum, and the MAGA's media machine amplifies it, continuing that legacy of weaponized communication. Trump and MAGA are heirs to these hateful movements and should own all the violence they incite. They rely on intimidation, force, and fear to maintain control and instigate their followers against the opposition. They have transformed terrorism into a governing strategy. The human rights dimension in Amnesty International. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have already documented Trump's abuses, deploying troops against protesters, suing independent media into bankruptcy, threatening to label an opposition party extremist, and weaponizing tariffs against entire populations are all violations of international human rights standards. Before Trump, the United States would have condemned any other country for these actions. Now, Trump's America leads the way in such atrocities, skipping happily on their way to hurt others at any given opportunity. When China cracked down on Hong Kong protesters, old Washington called it tyranny. Trump's Washington cracks down on protesters and intentionally violates their First Amendment rights. When Russia criminalized opposition parties, old Washington called it authoritarianism. Trump's Washington is blaming right-wing violence on the left wing and using those lies to try to justify criminalizing his opposition, the entire Democratic Party. The difference would be that old Washington condemned these actions, but Trump's Washington sees these other hate groups' actions as blueprints for their own. MAGA as the organization. MAGA function as an institutionalized terror network. It holds seats in Congress, shields Trump from accountability, amplifies his threats, and normalizes fear as a political strategy. History shows us what this means. The Nazi Party was not only a political organization, but a network of intimidation and violence. MAGA red hats follow the examples set by Hitler's brown shirts, and ICE is nothing more than the modern-day Gestapo. The Ku Klux Klan was not only a secret society, but a political force that shaped law and policy through terror. MAGA operates in that same tradition. It is organized, it is political, and it rules through fear and intimidation. Donald Trump is literally the embodiment of modern-day terrorism, and the MAGA GOP is the most powerful terrorist organization in the world. Historical terrorists would have loved to have been able to wield the hate and terror that Donald Trump and the MAGA GOP are wielding right now. Project 2025 is their fascist blueprint to institutionalize this terror permanently. It is designed to turn intimidation into law, to make fear the foundation of government, and to strip away the rights of anyone who resists their authority. Trump and the GOP are the terrorists, and we are all in danger, very real danger. America and the world needs to wake up. Fascism is here, and it's destroying our democracy. Sin safely, my friends. The dice are on the carpet. Take care.